I'm so happy to see that you're beginning to use the WhatsApp group to facilitate conversation and discussion about the Matmonim and the thoughts that it triggers, and some of the chidushim that each of you have and are able to share, introducing a dimension of chavrusa, a dimension of companionship and learning together, sharing ideas, which we haven't had previously on the Matmonim. So I hope that continues to grow. Often when we have two different positions, two different viewpoints, we assume that in order to resolve an apparent irreconcilable dimension of those two positions, a compromise is the obvious solution. And really the idea of compromise is so non-Torah. It's not a Torah idea at all. There are other ways to look at situations where two positions seem to be irreconcilable. The lie of the compromise, Heichi Kamtsi Menachot Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. We start off with two psukim. The one is in Parashas Tzav, and the other is in Parashas Vayikra. In Parashas Vayikra, we have the description of the process of the mincha. We've talked about how to actually take a mincha, how does the Kohen separate the flour that he's going to put on the mizbeach from the general flour that has been brought to the Beis HaMikdash. And he does that by virtually pinching a handful, we'll talk about what that handful looks like, out of the bowl of flour. And to do so, he uses his three middle fingers. And he folds his middle fingers and takes the flour between his middle fingers and his hand, turns his hand over, smooths the flour out, and that is the kmitza. The difficulty is we're not entirely sure how far back the fingers are meant to fold. In other words, how much flour he's meant to pick up. Is it just that the fingers fold up till the palm of the hand, and then there's very little flour just in the area covered by the fingers, or do the fingers fold back all the way over the hand, and that way there's a handful of flour, excluding anything which comes out of the sides, which is smoothed out. And there are two psukim that seem to imply differently. One says clearly melo kumtso, a complete handful, and the other one seems to imply bekumtso, in his handful, implying a portion of a handful, but not a full handful. And that's discussed by the Gemara when Abaye says to Rava, Ketzad komtzim. What is the method? How does one do this? How does one get hold of the flour in the hand? How does the Kohen do that? And Marzutra Batuvia says in the name of Rav, he takes the first view that you use your three fingers and fold them back as far as the beginning of your hand. So it's only the part of the fingers that is holding flour. The kometz tanyanami haki, and in fact there is such a brisa which is melo kumtso yachol mevuratz. It says your hand should be full, a full handful. Does that mean so much so that there's flour actually coming out between the fingers and out of the sides? Talmud loma bekumtza. No, it says bekumtzo, meaning a part of the handful, and it shouldn't be such a full handful. Again, we're almost focusing on that lack of adornment, that humility, which is not only qualitative in the mincha, but quantitatively as well. Yachol baroshe etzvotav, does that actually mean that you only fold back the tops of your fingers and it doesn't cover your hand? Talmud lomar, no, says the brisa. Melo kumtso, it says a full handful. Haketzad, how do you resolve the requirement of it being a full handful and it being a partial hand? Chofe shalosh etzvotav al pas yado v'kometz. He folds his fingers not until the beginning of the palm of his hand, but over the palm of his hand, so that his fingers are covering his full hand and the entire hand has flour within it between those first three fingers, the middle three fingers and the hand. The Rashba, and we've discussed before that the Chidushi Rashba that we have on Menachot is not the Rashba, even though it's referred to as the Rashba, and the Chidah considers it to be the Rashba, but most Acharonim, the early and later Acharonim, all agree this is another amazing Rishon, incredibly authoritative. The Sefer is used and quoted from the earliest of times of its having been written, but it isn't the Rashba, it's another Rishon. I saw this Rashba quoted, And I'll tell you first how it was quoted and what worried me about it as it was quoted and what I found when I learned the Rashba inside. It was quoted in one of these anthologies that we have that are enormously helpful in being able to understand and make sense of the Daf, particularly for people who are less well versed in the art of learning. And in one of these anthologies it says the Rashba explains the view of Rav as quoted by Rav Zutra Bar Tuvia. And that is that he's trying to create a compromise, a pshara, between the two psukim. One pasuk says you take just a finger full, just the amount is between the fingers and the fingers. In other words, you just curl your fingers back, and that's the amount of flour that you take. And the other one says you take an entire handful. So this idea of curling your fingers back, but further than the end of the fingers, curling them back all the way over the hand, achieves a compromise between the two psukim. And that word compromise worried me. It didn't seem feasible to me that the Rashba would use that word, because a compromise, as I mentioned in the opening, is not a Torah idea. When you compromise, you're compromising both ends. You're not creating a compromise that satisfies both ends. If A says, you owe me 100, and B says, I don't owe you anything, and a Dayan says, well, how about 50? You really have satisfied neither. If 100 is the truth, the full amount hasn't been paid. If nothing is the truth, then the person has paid more than he has to pay. He shouldn't have to pay anything at all. So there is a built-in lie, there's a deceitfulness, there's a dishonesty in a compromise. And it's not the same as a pshara in Dinei Mamonot. We talk about pshara, about the importance of compromise in the laws of monetary matters. A Beis Din, a Dayan, will sometimes make a pshara, but in Chosh and Mishpat, in monetary matters, when the Shulchan Aruch talks about pshara, it doesn't mean a compromise between two positions. It simply means an outcome agreed to by the two parties, which may not be strictly according to the laws of the Torah. The Dayan might say, I'm not qualified enough to tell you for sure what the Torah requires in such a situation. But it seems to me that a correct outcome would be A or B or X or Y. Do you two litigants agree? Would you accept that as the solution? But it might be 100% of the one claim or 100% of the other claim or something entirely different. It doesn't mean 50%. It doesn't mean going halfway and making a compromise, because the idea of compromise is a compromise, and we try and avoid it whenever we can. So I was very surprised to see it quoted that way. And of course, that's the limitation with these anthologies, is they are somebody's version of the Gemara. The Gemara is already interpreted in the way it is explained in these anthologies, and it's somebody's interpretation in the notes below. So as you're learning the Gemara, you're already getting interpretation. You're already getting a narrower view of what should be a starting point of very broad thinking in the learning process. That's not to mention how to use these anthologies. They're enormously valuable and helpful for people who are learning a piece of Gemara for the first time, but one needs to understand the limitations. So that word pshara seemed odd to me. So I looked at the Rashba, and I learned the Rashba inside. It's quoted in the source sheet. The Rashba brings the Gemara. It says, "Rutzon olamah sheyakuf roshei etzba'otav levad al tchilat kaf yado v'lo yikach min hakemach yimah." Does it mean you should just take a little bit, curling your fingers up only to the beginning of your hand? Or does it mean much more than that, and does it mean the full amount? Talmud lomar malei kumtzor. The Torah tells us malei kumtzor. Rutzon lomar demeachar shirabah hakatuv malei kumtzor mipnei she'amar bekumtzor. Since the Torah says in the one verse a full hand, and in the other word it says bekumtzor, with some of your hand, yesh lanu likach derech shaveh lekayem shnei hamikraot. We have to find a way to balance the views and be mekayem and fulfill both of them. It's not all. It's not, is it a small amount or is it a large amount? There's a way to lift up the flour with your hand that actually satisfies the requirements of both psukim. And that's what the Rashba says. It's not about, he doesn't use the word pshara, he doesn't use the word compromise. We use the word pshara also with lukewarm water. We say, maim poshrim. And lukewarm means it's neither hot nor cold. It doesn't mean it's hot and cold. It means it's neither hot nor cold. So when you make a pshara, when you make a compromise, it's neither A nor B. That's not what the Rashba is saying. The Rashba is saying, lekayem shnei hamikraot, that there's a way to be able to incorporate both of them. There is an and. It doesn't always have to be an or. If somebody says to you, should we do A or should we do B, it doesn't always require the choice of the one, nor does it require let's do something in between. Sometimes there are ways one has to think more creatively to find ways to be able to embrace both A and B in the way one moves forward. Or in a worldview, you have one particular worldview which is very purely A, and another worldview which is very particularly B and completely different. Sometimes you can take the two and not compromise between them, because a compromise is a lie, but one can harmonize the two in a third idea, a katuva shlishi. We're told that if there are two ktuvim hamakchishim ze et ze, if there are two psukim that contradict one another, sometimes there's a third verse which adds a dimension, and with the third dimension, everything becomes integrated, everything becomes united. And that's what we try to do in learning. We can't always do it, but that's what we try to do in learning, is to be able to find the way to incorporate as much as possible and to reject as little as possible as we do it. And this is the meaning of the law of Rav as to how we do a kmitza, teaching us that although the psukim seem somewhat contradictory, there is a way that we can be mekayim, melo kumtzol, a whole handful, and partial handful, by using those three fingers, folding them back over the hand, and taking into them the flour that one can.